For people with disabilities, 9 down and 1 to go. Hello, and welcome to a special edition of DNet, the Disability Network. I'm Sheyfali Saujani. It's been 9 years since the Decade of Disabled Persons was declared by the United Nations. We have 1 year to go. One of the 8 principles contained in that UN declaration states the dignity, independence, and potential of persons with disabilities will be respected in all aspects of life. Another states services and programs will be aimed at integrating persons with disabilities into existing social and economic structures. Today we're going to meet 2 women whose careers and personal growth reflect the positive sides of that decade. Sandra Carpenter and Tracy ODell are sisters. Both were born with muscular dystrophy and have used wheelchairs all their life. Sandra Carpenter is Senior Policy Analyst with the Ontario Office for Disability Issues. She is one of the founders of the Independence Living Movement in Canada. Tracy ODell also works for the Ontario Government. She is the Literacy Access Coordinator for the Ministry of Education's Literacy Branch. Both sisters are married. Tracy ODell has 2 young children, Katie, who is 3, and Heather, who is 1 year old. Welcome to Disability Network.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Sandra, I'd like to start with you. Both of you were institutionalized very early in life, you at the age of 11 and Tracy at 7. Why were you put into institutions?
Well, I think the primary reason was that we grew up in Ottawa, and in those days there was virtually nothing in the way of support services. There was no accessible transportation, there was no support services, there were no people who could come around to the home, for example, and give a parent any kind of relief. And there wasn't the same kind of support to keep or enable children to go to school in the public school system. So I think that all things considered, our parents just thought that the opportunities were too limited for us to sort of stay at home and basically be stuck in the apartment and stare at the walls.
What was it like for you there, Tracy?
Well, when I first went there, I didn't think too much about going to the institution. I just thought I'd be going to be with my sister because she had been there, several months ahead of me. But by the time I started reaching 10 and 11 years old, I just found the environment really confining and really restricting, very frustrated. I didn't like living in an institution at all.
What do you mean confining? Can you give me an example?
I guess there were just a lot of it seemed to me a lot of rules and regulations about where we could go. Like for the first several years that I was there, like we were very rarely allowed off of the ward that we were on. It was only if there was a special structured activity that was put on by the recreation department, we might be allowed to leave the floor, and then we left the floor for school, or that kind of thing. But most of the time was spent right there.
Sandra, do you remember any of the things that stand out as exemplifying that restricted life?
Well, the kind of things that I found confining were more things that had to do with just a kind of an attitude and a kind of an expectation that was around you in terms of taking responsibility for yourself and making your own decisions or having any kind of challenges. I think as the years went by, though, there was some other kind of more insidious things that kept creeping in. For example, there was a certain time, which was just a few years after both Tracy and I were there, where the place was trying to get hospital accreditation. And then all of a sudden there were things that happened, like I remember they were trying to make us wear hospital bands for a while, for example, and then there was
Were you sick?
No. But they didn't want to lose track of us because we were very easy to misplace. And they were, taking our temperatures every day. And
I mean, the average stay for kids there was probably 7 to 8 years. So wearing a name bracelet seemed really ridiculous. Like it was very easy for staff to know our names. And it was just literally to make you look like a patient in a hospital. And we refused to wear them. Like we cut them off with scissors. And when our scissors were confiscated, we chewed them off with our teeth. Like we just kept doing it until they ran out of bracelets and gave up.
They gave up.
But you didn't just cut them off for yourself. I gather that you went beyond that.
Well, anyone that wanted their bracelet snipped, God help.
But you'd be surprised. There was hardly a kid, no matter how disabled they were, that couldn't get their own bracelet off. one way or the other.
So how did they regard this kind of activity by the two of you?
Well, I mean, it was pretty well a mass act of
rebellion.
civil disobedience, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think they just gave up. I think somebody somewhere must have seen these were all the things that had to do with lists on paper that said that, if you want to be accredited, you have to do this, that, and the other. And I guess somehow they got an exemption to that particular rule. It was really silly.
Was it necessary for you to be institutionalized in this way?
Well, given that there was no services and there was no support for the family in the way that we needed, I would say yes, given the time. But in terms of that as an alternative, I mean, that was not particularly the kind of alternative that we needed or that was necessary. Like, in other words, we didn't need 24-hour supervision, we didn't need nursing care, we didn't need all that the institution had to offer. But we certainly did need something. We certainly needed access, we needed to be able to get out to school, and we needed to have some bodies around to help, our mother and father with our care.
And see, this was the issue. Like, to get those services, you had to go live in their building and be under their roof. And then you could have your wheelchair provided and your dental care provided and so on. Like, all of that was kind of a package deal, but you had to leave home to get that service. At the time that I left, which was in 1976, the cost per day for a child living in that institution was $100 a day of taxpayers' money. And when you think about the cost, for my sister and I both to be there, that would have been double that money over all of those years. And if our parents had had maybe that amount per week to work with, they wouldn't have had a difficulty in terms of purchasing the services that we might have needed to stay at home. So in one way, it's absolutely unnecessary if there's a commitment to, how money is spent and what we decide we want to spend money on. In that day, it seemed a lot more important to spend the money to get kids out of their home to get the services, which, to this day I'm furious about that that's a choice. And, I don't think we're a society that believes in orphanages for kids. We get kids fostered out, we have kids adopted. So, in our instance, I think that our families would have preferred that we stay at home, and yet we were still institutionalized. So that seemed to be, the priority at that time.
We're going to take a commercial break, and when we come back, we'll find out how you broke free of institutional life. You're watching DNET, the Disability Network. We're back. My guests are Sandra Carpenter and Tracy ODell. Most people who start life in institutions tend to end up staying there, but you didn't. Sandra, can you tell me how you broke free of that?
Well, I think it was sort of a long process, but the first and most important thing was that I never thought that I would stay there. Like, when, probably there was not a day or a minute in the day that passed that I didn't always keep that goal in mind, that, when I was old enough and had that legal independence, that I would, move out one way, shape, or form and get on my own. I never intended to stay.
How did you do it, given the fact that there was no attendant care, that a lot of the support services didn't exist?
Well, in my case, what happened was I was going out with a guy, so I ended up getting married, and he was not a disabled person, so that was kind of, I don't want to make it sound so cold, cut and dried, but
there was a little bit of love.
There was a little bit, yeah, but it was cut and dried. But unfortunately, there was some other difficulties there, so that didn't work out. And then I ended up living with some friends. Like, I had some good friends. But also in those early years, there was a government program under the Ministry of Community and Social Services called Vocational Rehabilitation Services. And I think they still do, but what they would do is, while you were in school, it was kind of, in a way, a very progressive program for the time, because anything that you needed to stay in school, they would provide it, as long as you had a good relationship with your worker who was supportive of what you wanted. If you didn't agree with your worker, you may have had a difficulty, but we agreed. So one of the things was that we got some funding from that program to pay for somebody, like, you know, a couple of hours a day. And that kind of worked out for a few years until I graduated, but by then I was in another relationship with another person. So
what was it like for you to get out into the community after so many years of confinement into an institution where you hadn't had to deal with public reactions to your wheelchairs?
Well, it happened in stages. I mean, my first, I guess, launch back into the community was when I started high school. Like, I was still living at the hospital, but I got to go out to high school. And so I had to learn some things all over again about how to make friends. I'd kind of forgotten about how to do that in a real setting. Like, my setting was still, you know, fairly artificial. And when you live with the same kids all the time, you don't really have to deal with friends. So, you know, that was one angle to it. And, you know, I guess it was just a very gradual transition back. Like, by the time I left, my sister had told me about an apartment that was starting up that would offer the attendant service. And I was very lucky to be picked to be able to live there, because there was a lot of competition for that spot. Like, that was like winning a lottery to me, better than the 649. But I got to move in there, and that was my ticket out of the institution, was having a place to live and using the same vocational rehabilitation service that Sandy described to go to school.
Do you remember what it was like the first time you were wheeling down the street?
Well, it's funny. Now, for Tracy, it may be different because she was a lot younger when she first went there, but I never had that same sense of separation from the world. It was like sort of the aberration in my life was being in the institution. Like, being outside was, you know, better, you know, or more normal, or felt better or something.
Was it normal for the people who weren't used to seeing people?
I think my experiences were that people got used to you really fast. Like for example, when I first went to high school, I mean, it was a big inner city high school, over 2,000 people there. And, but that high school always had sort of 1 or 2 people a year in wheelchairs there, so it wasn't really that outside the culture. I found the kids got used to it pretty quickly.
I remember, I mean, years ago, people stopping to stare when you went down the street, though. You know, I mean, they'd literally stop and they'd stare with their jaw dropping open. But now, I mean, if people did that every time they saw someone in a wheelchair, they'd never get where they were going, you know, because people are out there so much more. There's quite a contrast.
But, you know, the interesting thing about that is when I went to college, when I went to Ryerson, the friends that I made there said, this one friend of mine said to me one day, "I'm not going to go in the cafeteria with you anymore." And of course, I was quite insulted. I thought, well, why don't you want to go in the cafeteria with me? He said, well, because when we go in the cafeteria, everybody stares at us. So we went in the cafeteria, and he was right. Like, you know, everybody turned and stared. And so it's very interesting, because I think over the years, I just didn't even pay attention anymore to the reaction. And I only paid attention to the people who would engage in a kind of a real level of relationship with me, and the rest of them, well, was their problem.
We have to go to another commercial break, but when we come back, we'll find out what we've accomplished so far in the decade of the disabled. You're watching DNET, the Disability Network. My guests are Sandra Carpenter and her sister Tracy ODell. In this segment of Disability Network, we'll find out what's changed so far in the decade of the disabled. Tracy, we have 1 year left in the decade of the disabled. What's been accomplished?
Well, I know for myself, I'm working, obtaining reasonable accommodation for my job in terms of access was very straightforward to negotiate. And that was terrific in itself. And I think back to some of the very explicit messages that I got in my childhood, that I would always be living in a nursing home, that I would be in a sheltered workshop, and, you know, this was as far as the vision went for people like me when I was 18 years old. And, you know, I'm far from a sheltered workshop situation, and I'm certainly far from a nursing home. I'm living in the community. I use attendant support, but I'm still independent, because I direct what kind of service I'm getting and when. I'm married, I have 2 children. You know, in a lot of ways, I think I have a fairly typical life. And, so on a personal level, I feel that a lot has been accomplished.
Sandra, how has your life changed as a result of the decade of the disabled?
Again, it's hard to sort of separate that out and get a handle on what's changed because of the disabled and what's just changed because of me. I guess personally, the thing that's most rewarding in my life is my marriage to my husband, John Brown. And that's a personal thing, and I can't really attribute that to the decade.
The United Nations didn't have anything to do with that.
But, but I mean, I think Tracy is right when she talks about that the changes that have changed in terms of the job and the accommodation and so on and so forth. Because when I first graduated, like my first job, it was very difficult. Although there was a lot of support, there was a lot of difficulty just around, sort of integrating into the workplace and the attitudes of the coworkers and then I left government for a while and I was working at the Independent Living Centre in Toronto. But then when I went back to work for government, there was a very different atmosphere in terms of what people understood they had to do in terms of accommodation, not begrudgingly, but in a new way that you really didn't have to feel so apologetic about having to say, hey, I need my desk lowered, or hey, I need this computer set up in this way, or I need a speakerphone. Like, there was no apology anymore. It was like, well, these were reasonable things that you were asking for that ensured that you could continue to function, and that was kind of a pretty specific difference, I think. That's you can point pretty directly to the influence of the decade that's done that.
It's all of these things put together. It's not that any one particular thing might have been monumental, but when you put the fact that there's accessible transportation with a more open job environment, and that people are out there and visible, then you're more socially accepted, and so relationships are more possible too. So all of these things feed into each other and nurture each other.
Is it enough?
Is it enough? Never. No, not as far as I'm concerned. There's a lot more that I'd like to achieve and do, and
Like
and
what?
the thing is too, like, we're still considered exceptional. Like, it'll be enough when we're typical, like that this is more of a typical experience for people with disabilities. That's like when it will be enough.
What do you think is the big stumbling block left? Is there a major thing that you'd like to see swept out of the way?
Well, there are these services that Tracy and I have had access to, but those services are not a sort of a bottomless pit. In other words, the waiting list for some of these services that we've been talking about are getting longer and longer, and there's still a lot of people that, for one reason or another, because the family doesn't have the resources on their own to do these things, for their kids or their young adults. They're still either in institutions, or they may be stuck at home, or they've never gotten the kind of education that helped them reach their capacity. I mean, there's still a lot of people that are basically, maybe not as many as when I was a kid, but there's still a lot of people out there who are facing the same kind of struggles, and it's no easier for them and their families in their communities than it was for us when we were young.
Tracy, do you think some of the old attitudes about the potential of persons with disabilities and the limitations still exist today? Do you think they still linger?
I think in a lot of circles they do still linger, and they've become even more entrenched, in terms of assessment and medical terminology and so on, that there are lots of formal ways of limiting what people's potentials are and giving people the message that they might only achieve this grade level or reach a particular level. I've been fairly lucky because I've usually in my circle had some very key people who believed in me and who helped me to keep going forward. And I know a lot of people don't have that, and maybe that's what's holding some people back.
We have one more commercial break, but when we come back, I'd like to find out what advice you have for other people with disabilities. You're watching DNET, the Disability Network. Sheyfali, I want to ask you both about what advice you have for other people with disabilities based on the experiences that you've had in your lives. Sandra, can you tell me what a person who is going through some of the struggles that you've been through might consider that would help them get through it?
I guess I just have to reflect back, like, from the time I was really young, unless it was somebody that I really trusted, like my own family, I didn't really listen to things. I mean, they would think I was listening to them, but deep down I always sort of held a bit of a cynical attitude about it. And I always tried to refer more sort of deep down within myself in terms of whether that was right or if I thought that was true. Like, for example, if they would say, you can't go to school because you're too disabled, well, I would automatically question that. And, I would make them sort of engage in a exercise of proving that to me, and it would just sort of become a test of will in terms of, well, yes, I can do that. Well, let me show you. It was always like, you never want to take the word for what they say. It was like, well, if you say I can't go out to high school, then let me go and try, and if I can't, I'll come back, but if I do okay, then you have to let me stay there. Like, sort of that kind of approach. It's always sort of challenging and trying to keep a faith in yourself.
Is that the same strategy that you use, Tracy, just sheer stubbornness?
Oh, well, I guess that's genetic or something, because, yeah, I've got that grain in me too, so I'm told by my husband. But I think one of the turning points for me was about 3 or 4 years after I'd left the institution. And a good friend of mine, Marcia Forrest, was picking me up in her car to take me somewhere, to her house or a conference or something. And I was gushing in the car. Oh, thank you for picking me up. Thank you so much. It was so nice of you to come in. It's so out of your way. Oh, thank you, thank you. And she just looked at me and she said, will you quit thanking me? Like, I would pick up any friend of mine. It's no big deal. You have a right to come, and I want you to come, and so let's go and quit thanking me. And from that moment on, it just clicked that I really did have a right to exist. And I really did have a right to occupy the space that I occupy and to be there. And I didn't have to be grateful.
You've not only occupied the space that you occupy, you've gone on and procreated. How do your children?
How are they?
Yeah. How do you teach them the same things that you've learned?
Well, they're still pretty young, and I guess it's still shown to be a test. But I hope I can just instill with them, some respect for themselves as people.
Sandra, final word?
Final word. Well, I guess you always just have to keep trying and just be the best you can be, and get out there, no matter how nervous you feel about it or how hard it is. Get out there, because that's how people learn lessons about disability and what it means. I mean, in spite of all the programs and initiatives and anything that could ever happen, the thing that tends to have the most effect is just working side by side with another disabled person, or going to school and your classmate has a disability. So it's really important to get out there, with the tabs, as we call them, the temporarily able-bodied, and let them get to know who you are.
Sandra Carpenter and Tracy ODell, thank you very much for sharing your thoughts with us.
Thank you.
This has been Disability Network. I'm Sheyfali Saujani. Thank you for watching. What do you think about International Decade for Disabled Persons? If you are disabled, has the quality of your life improved? Call our opinion line. It's at area code 416-921-7933. That's 416-921-7933. Or write us at the Disability Network, CBC, Box 500, Station A, Toronto, M5W 1E6. That's Disability Network, CBC, Box 500, Station A, Toronto, M5W 1E6.